Hello and welcome to this special Reuters interview series looking at the impact of misinformation on our communities. These interviews are independently produced by the Reuters editorial team. Before we begin, we will first hear from Facebook, the sponsors of this series.
Hello, my name is Aida. I lead and develop external partnership and programs to help combat online misinformation across Europe, Middle East, and Africa. It's my pleasure to introduce today's talk on misinformation and the law. Is regulation the solution? At Facebook, we work very hard to improve the accuracy of information on our platform. This is a responsibility we take seriously. Across Newsfeed, we follow a three-part framework to improve the quality and authenticity of information. We remove account and content that violate our community standards or ad policy. When misinformation doesn't violate our policies, we reduce its distribution through an industry-leading fact-checking program. We work with over 80 fact-checkers across the world who identify, review, and rate content on the platform. We also inform people by giving them more context on the posts that they see. In addition to this work, we want to empower people to decide for themselves what to read, trust, and share. And we have done this by rolling out new products and partnership, but also a key part of this work is building on-platform media literacy campaigns that we have developed in partnership with fact-checkers and experts like the WHO. We are particularly looking forward to today's discussion because misinformation is a complex problem and requires a society-wide approach to prevent its spread and build more informed communities.
Thank you for watching. I'm Hazel Baker, I'm a Reuters journalist and I'm the editor of our social media fact-checking unit. From politics to a pandemic, the problem of misinformation and the way it can be rapidly shared is a major area of concern for governments globally. Incorrect information that becomes widespread can be harmful for a population's health, democratic processes, and social cohesion. It's a problem with no easy solution, not least because of disagreement over what exactly constitutes misinformation and who ought to be the arbitrator of truth. Despite these difficulties, leaders across continents have turned to the law in a bid to control the dissemination of information deemed to be false. But have these regulatory efforts worked, and at what cost to citizens? To examine these questions, I have with me two experts today. Marko Milanovic is Professor of Public International Law at the University of Nottingham. His areas of expertise include human rights law, public international law, and international criminal law, and his work has been cited by judges of the European Court of Human Rights. A particular focus of his is the applicability of human rights in the digital age. Mary Stella Simiyu is Programme Officer at the Centre for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria. She's a Doctor of Laws candidate at the university and a researcher in the Expression, Information and Digital Rights Unit, where she examines areas including democratisation in Africa, international human rights law, elections and digital rights. A warm welcome to you both. Professor Marko Milanovic, I know that you've been examining the efforts of governments around the world to prevent misinformation or disinformation, which is a subset of misinformation with intent behind it. How are they doing this? Are they writing brand new laws or are they repurposing existing ones?
Thank you very much, Hazel. It's a great question. It's a privilege to be with you today. Let me backtrack a bit on your question. So there's the question of which governments are we talking about here? Because on the one hand, you have liberal democracies who have good faith efforts in trying to regulate misinformation to prevent some significant social harms that misinformation or disinformation is causing. But on the other hand, you may have authoritarian states, or certainly states verging on that spectrum towards authoritarianism, who are actually using misinformation or disinformation laws in order to suppress criticism and dissent, in order to maintain their own control of the state. Okay? And now the biggest question actually in this whole sphere is that it is the government normally that is the single largest source of mis and disinformation, and that mis and disinformation spread by government officials is much more harmful than that spread by private actors. In authoritarian states, that's the basic business model of these authoritarian states. If you grow up in one, as I have grown up in one by and large, the idea of the state lying to you is something perfectly normal. I mean, that's something that you live with every day. But even in democracies, we have seen governmental actors spreading incredibly harmful misinformation. So think again, Donald Trump, think Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. They have done much more harm with the mis and disinformation they have spread about health or about elections, for example, than any private actor ever could. Okay, so that whole issue of governmental misinformation as essentially a violation of human rights is something that really needs to be confronted directly. Through that type of misinformation, governments can violate freedom of expression of people, the freedom of opinion of people, because they're manipulating their citizens or specific rights, such as the right to health. Then there is the question of regulation of misinformation by states, of misinformation being spread by private actors. And there are really two basic ways in which states do so or have done so. One is through criminal laws, where states make it a criminal offense for somebody to say something false then that produces a harmful consequence. Or they can do so through media laws, basically directing the media, digital or offline, to comport with some kind of accuracy standards, for example. There are many, many different ways of regulating the media, whether by the state, through self-regulation, through co-regulation by the media industry and by the state. And coming to the last part of your question, are there old laws, are there new laws? Well, it's actually a mix of both. In the criminal law sphere, there are some states, even democratic states, that have had very specific misinformation laws for a very long time. For example, in Canada and the UK, you have it's a criminal offense to say, for example, that a candidate for an election has died or has committed a criminal offense, when this is not true. On the other hand, you have states that have taken advantage of the COVID pandemic to implement completely new criminal laws. Russia has done that, for example. South Africa has done that. Hungary has done that. And then there's the whole sphere of media laws. Again, we have very established rules on defamation, on correction, the right to reply, on accuracy standards for the press. But then we have new types of laws emerging, especially for the online environment. If you want to think of a particularly good or bad example of that, the Singaporean fake news law, or POFMA, is precisely one such example.
I see, so there's quite a range. And starting at the very basics here, and perhaps it's not so basic, how do these laws actually define what is false or misleading information, and who is deciding whether it is true or false?
Well, these laws often don't actually provide a very good definition of what is and what is not true. Some of them are very broad and vague. And the broader and vaguer that type of law is, the more difficult it is to justify, because it generates chilling effects on free speech. Okay. Some laws, on the other hand, are very specific. So, for example, a law that says that it is prohibited to spread false information about cures for COVID is a fairly specific law. Now, the question of who decides is the pivotal question. If it is the state regulating this, it will be the state deciding what is true or what is false. And there's a great danger in this, because there's always a potential for abuse, that the state will actually be suppressing criticism and dissent. In some contexts, we have traditionally been very comfortable with the state deciding on the falsity of some information. So, for example, in the defamation context, it's completely straightforward that it will be an independent court that will decide whether a particular statement was true or false. In, for example, the context of false advertising, we will have some kind of independent regulatory authority that will make decisions on what is true and what is not true. The biggest danger is when state executive officials, politicians, take it upon themselves to decide on truth and falsity. And for example, in the Singaporean POFMA law that I mentioned before, it is a minister who can command Facebook, for example, to label a certain item of information on its platform as false, or order Facebook to remove it, or Singapore will take actions against it. So those types of laws where the executive can decide what is true and what is false are the most dangerous. On the other hand, we have digital platforms like Facebook, who find themselves in the position of being arbiters of truth. They have to decide what is false or true on their platform, and that's just inevitable if you leave it to digital platforms to regulate this sphere.
I see. And so is there a role for any sort of independent body entirely, so not a government body, not a social media platform? Have you seen anything falling into that sort of category?
Well, yes. I mean, so in many countries, you have independent media regulatory bodies, like, for example, Ofcom in the UK. And in principle, it is legitimate for such an independent regulatory body with being vested with the power to make some decisions on what is true, what is false, what can be said and cannot be said. The biggest problem is when that type of independent regulatory body is captured by those who have political power. And you have that in many states. In many states, you have sort of quasi-independent bodies that are actually controlled by political parties, right? So that is the most dangerous type of situation.
I see. Thanks very much for running us through that. So who are you seeing these laws being aimed at? Do you think they're generally aimed at the media or individuals, people, spreading whatever they like on their social media accounts? What have you seen? What patterns?
I like the word you use, aimed at, right? Because it can be interpreted in different ways. If by aimed at you mean, who do these laws cover? Who do they apply to? Criminal laws, they tend to cover everyone. Media regulation obviously will tend to cover only the media. But there's a different way of using the word aimed at, which is what is the purpose behind them. And sometimes, as I said, the real purpose behind these laws is actually for the state to control the media space. They're aimed at journalists as a method of controlling them, right? So it's the state that's saying, for example, we're doing this to protect public health. But in reality, they're acting with an ulterior purpose, which is to suppress criticism and dissent.
And if the aim is to suppress, as you've outlined there, what kind of penalties do these laws carry if they're breached?
Well, penalties are not bad, as such at least, right? Penalties are what induces people to behave according to the law. If penalties are proportionate and they serve a legitimate purpose, penalties are good. The problem is that they often don't. They're often not proportionate. They often do not serve a legitimate purpose. Now, in the criminal context, penalties in misinformation, disinformation laws can range from fines to imprisonment. I mean, if you want to see a very bad example, a bad example is the criminal law of Cameroon, which criminalizes the spreading of any false news, okay, that the speaker does not have a good reason to believe to be true. And you can go to prison for up to 5 years if you spread that type of information, which can be about anything. It's completely left undefined. And you spread fake news or false news anonymously, the penalties are doubled. You can go to prison for up to 10 years, right? In the media regulation context, regulators often have a lot of power. They can issue fines. They can make it very difficult for a media organization to do their business. They can block websites. They can mandate corrections or warnings. They can do all sorts of things. Again, these are not necessarily bad tools. The question is how they're being used.
I see. And my final question before I move on to Mary Stella, is it possible to generate a law that can combat misinformation yet still maintain freedom of expression?
Yes, that's an easy answer. Yes, it's possible. But that law has to meet the international standards for limiting the freedom of speech. The freedom of speech is not an absolute right. It can be limited. It can be limited if the limitation serves a legitimate aim, if it is provided for by law, if it's necessary in proportion to that aim. So, for example, a law that says you cannot persuade people that eating garlic will cure them from COVID, or that drinking bleach will cure them from COVID, and you cause harm by making that speech. People actually drink bleach. There is no problem in principle with justifying that type of law that puts a person in prison who intentionally misled others into drinking bleach, right? The question is, how is that law framed? And again, what is the actual purpose behind that type of law?
Great, thanks so much. We'll come on to a couple of those points later. Over to Mary Stella, and I'd really like to hear about what your department's been researching, particularly with the situation with various African countries around the time of the pandemic. Can you tell us about any efforts that you've seen to bring in regulation to try and stem misinformation or disinformation?
All right, thank you very much, Hazel. So you are right. The expression unit that I work for, as part of a collaborative effort, did engage in a project that we looked at the regulatory environment in Africa. And we ended up coming up with what we call the disinformation tracker that basically looked at the landscape when it comes to false information in Africa. And we saw that the strategies that are used in different countries is, as Marco mentioned, a mixture of different laws. So we have a mixture of all penal laws, many of which were enacted before the colonial times and have gone through different amendments. And we have different media laws also having provisions on false information, misinformation, and disinformation. We have a new crop of cybercrime and cybersecurity laws that have been coming up recently. as well as context-inspired laws on disinformation. This is now really around COVID-19. We didn't find any law particularly that was disinformation specific, apart from in Nigeria, where there was an attempt to establish a law on disinformation, but as it stands right now, it is actually defeated. And I'll just talk about that later. But just to give examples, in Southern Africa, for example, Botswana has a penal code which has provisions on false news. There's a media law, there's a cybercrime law that was enacted in 2018, as well as COVID regulations, which have provisions on false news. In a country like DRC, which is in Central Africa, there's a penal code which was enacted in 1940 with amendments up to 2004, which has provisions on false news, as well as a media law. In Kenya, which is in Eastern Africa, there's a penal code with provisions on false news. There are media laws with provisions on false news, as well as a cybercrime act that was enacted in 2018. In Nigeria, which is in West Africa, it has a cybercrime act, which has provisions on false news, as well as its criminal code. And when we were going through this project on the disinformation tracker, one of the trends that we saw is that there's this increasingly emphasis by countries to criminalize digital communication. But what was worrying is that in many of the provisions in these statutes, that they are vague and broad provisions, which also Marco mentioned, that are open to wide and subjective interpretation. There is little clarity that is provided in these laws when it comes to definitions of what is false, what is misleading, and what is inaccurate information. And when we examine these provisions against, the test for limitation of rights, when it comes to legality, there need to be concise provisions. It needs to be precisely drafted in such a way that it guides actions from ordinary citizens, as well as other people who are affected by these laws. Marco talked about the legitimate aims, and we've noticed in Africa, a lot of these laws on false information are geared towards preserving national security or public order, which are legitimate aims as recognized under international law and standards. But when you now look at the third test of necessity, and is it proportionate in a democratic society, especially when you look at the sanctions that are attached to these laws, they fail in this regard, because when we look at certain harsh sanctions, they seem to be we can be able to say they're actually less restrictive means that can achieve the legitimate aims that these laws try to achieve. So, for example, in the case of Mauritius, which has a Media Law Act, an ICT Act that has provisions on false news, there's a provision that criminalizes the usage of telecommunications to deliver messages, which are, among other things, false and likely to cause or causes annoyance, humiliation, inconvenience, distress, or anxiety. And our concern in this regard is that these are very broadly worded provisions. These are vague provisions, and such that different information, be it false, yes, might elicit different reactions from people. And it provides a very broad room for interpretation by enforcement agencies that is susceptible to misuse. And we see Botswana also has an act that is closely worded to the Mauritian situation. In Nigeria, another example, its Cybercrimes Act also criminalizes the intentional spread of false information that can cause, among other things, danger, anxiety, intimidation, enmity, needless anxiety. So our concern was around phrases such as needless anxiety, inconvenience, because these are actually very vague provisions, and it does leave room for broad interpretation by enforcement agencies. And we assess this also based on the link between the expression and the threat of harm. There seem to be, yes, there's an expression here that might or might not be protected, but the link towards whether it can actually cause harm, whether there's an imminence of harm, is lacking in a lot of these provisions. And our concern was that there is a likelihood, which we have seen materialize in very different and many contexts in Africa, that the authorities will disproportionately use these laws to muzzle journalists, activists, human rights defenders, civil society organizations, and other critics of the establishment, because the way they are phrased leaves room, as I said, to broad interpretation. And we also felt that these provisions end up giving a lot of responsibility to citizens to verify the accuracy of information. It is true, we need to be responsible users of information. We need to be responsible in terms of how we communicate. But there's a lot of, it's a sort of onerous responsibility that has been given to citizens to verify this information before they communicate. And it's sort of a bad, let me not call it a burden, let me say there's an obligation to tell the truth that comes out from these statutes. And the worry also for us was that some of these provisions could lead to self-censorship because they're not so clearly drafted, they're not precisely drafted as per the requirement of legality, they are not precisely drafted enough for citizens to know which expression is protected, which expression is not protected. And because of this, it can actually lead to self-censorship.
Thank you so much. I mean, some of those definitions sound incredibly broad. And certainly from what we've seen through our fact-checking work here at Reuters is that many people share misleading, false information without necessarily realising what they've shared is false. To what extent do these new laws have on kind of dampening people's freedom to use social platforms and other means of communication? Are you seeing any evidence that it's kind of stifling freedom of speech?
Oh, definitely. It's already stifling freedom of speech, even just given the sanctions that are there, it's already stifling freedom of speech, because we have seen incidences where critics have been arrested and charged under this act. In Kenya recently, there's a human rights activist who shared a satirical post. It was clearly satirical from reading that post, but he was charged under the act, but it was not specifically identified which section of the act, which, for example, falls under false publication that he was charged in. But we have seen a lot of online bloggers being targeted by these acts, especially if they are critical of the establishment, especially when they are raising issues around corruption or how government is addressing a particular subject. This is when you see that these laws are misapplied in terms of just silencing and muzzling certain voices in society.
Thanks. And is there any opportunity for people who have perhaps been sanctioned by these laws to appeal? Do they have any route to dispute the laws that they've been caught by?
So first, if we could look at the sanctions, I feel a number of those sanctions are disproportionate. So in the case of Mauritius, it's ICT Act. If you're convicted under the act, you can be liable to a fine of up to an equivalent of $25,000 or an imprisonment term of up to 10 years. And I will echo what Marco said in terms of sanctions. Here it's an issue of whether they are proportionate or not. In the case of Nigeria, you can be liable to a fine of up to $19,000 and an imprisonment term of 3 years, or both, depending on the situation. In the case of Kenya, you might be liable to a fine of up to $50,000 or an imprisonment term of up to 2 years or 10 years, depending on which sections you're charged under. So the thing is, when we look at international laws and standards currently as it stands, and I will make mention to a declaration that was passed by the African Commission, and this is the Declaration on Freedom of Expression, on the Principles of Freedom of Expression and Access to Information in Africa. And it actually calls on countries to repeal criminal laws that criminalize false news. And what we see is that more countries are enacting laws that criminalize false news as opposed to repealing laws that criminalize false news. And there's a reason for this. It's because these laws are subject to misuse by authoritarian governments, especially in Africa. But you have asked whether there's been any responses to this. And I feel it's very important in many contexts where these laws are being passed to have a robust media and a robust civil society network, as well as citizens who are just generally conscious and invested in how to realize the right to freedom of expression. And for example, Marco mentioned South Africa in the context of COVID, but I'll mention South Africa also in the context of a cyber crimes and cybersecurity bill that was drafted in 2017, which had a clause that criminalized the publication of false news. The clause was widely criticized by people to the extent of how it limited freedom of expression. And because of the activism and the condemnation around that clause, the whole section around cybersecurity was deleted. And in the final act that was signed this year in May, that section was not there. In the case of Nigeria, which I mentioned was the only country we found that attempted to pass a disinformation-specific law. This law did not pass. It was widely referred to as the anti-social media bill because it had wide provisions on internet censorship. it was justified on the grounds of national security. And we could see provisions where it would allow the Nigerian government to disrupt or shut down internet, as well as block certain social media platforms such as WhatsApp, Facebook, and Twitter on their own discretion. It will also give wide discretion to police officers to police content in terms of proper content online. And it was felt that the bill was very repetitive because certain provisions were already covered in the Cybercrimes Act, as well as the media laws. And in 2020, there was a Senate hearing for this bill, and there was widespread condemnation from stakeholders in this bill. So this just basically shows the importance of having, a strong civil society network. And even before we go to the next question, there's also an indication of the importance of advocacy in Kenya, where the computer misuse and cybercrime law is currently in court being challenged. On the grounds that it's not constitutional, as well as it is in violation of international laws and standards when it comes to freedom of expression. And two of the sections that are contentious are the sections on the criminalization of false news. So there is advocacy and responses around these laws that are challenging whether they actually meet international laws and standards, as well as constitutional provisions on freedom of expression.
That's good to know. Thank you. Now, just a final question. Have you seen anything that's changed over the course of the pandemic? Has COVID-19 led to an increase in attempts to regulate misinformation? Is there any patterns that you might have seen over the last few months?
Yes, certainly. Since COVID came and we had to actually look at other issues, health misinformation became one of the concerns in a lot of countries, especially where there's widespread, not widespread, but let's say considerable internet penetration in African countries. And in South Africa, which Marco mentioned a bit, there were regulations that were made under the Disaster Management Act. And it had a provision that criminalized the intention to deceive another person about COVID-19, the infection status of any person, or any measure taken by government to address COVID-19. If you look at the wording of those provisions, because I have just mentioned them verbatim, they are very broad, because when you say about COVID-19, if you're going to criminalize an intention to deceive about COVID-19, that is very broad. And if you're criminalizing something on any measure taken by government to address COVID-19, that is very broad, and it's actually inimical to public discourse. And if you consider the fact that even right now, I think we're in the second year of the pandemic, there's still a lot of information that is coming up about the pandemic. There's still a lot of uncertainty around COVID, and there's a lot of public discourse around COVID. It is inevitable that during one of these discussions that certain inaccurate statements, false statements might be made. So we understand the need to regulate health misinformation, and it is one of the legitimate aims of restricting freedom of expression under the ICCPR. But how is it being done? Through such broad provisions means that there's room for these provisions being misused by certain governments.
I see.
And there's also a concern that there's really little room in terms of the connection between the false news and the conduct in terms of what harms it realizes. These provisions in South Africa, in Botswana, which is quite similar, and also Namibia, there's a tenuous link between the expression and the harm that it's going to realize.
I see. So understanding the scope and the proportionality is a key aspect to consider around these regulations. We're nearly out of time, but Marko Milanovic, I just wanted to bring you back in sort of on that point. You mentioned a few minutes ago that it is possible to draft a law that protects freedom of expression while still addressing the issues of misinformation. We only have a minute or so left, but perhaps you could give me an overview of what might be the best practices for legislators when considering drafting a bill of this nature.
I mean, that is the question, right? How do you regulate this in a way that's compatible with the freedom of expression? So you need to have narrow, specific, precise laws. Okay, so vague laws are incredibly dangerous because they generate self-censorship chilling effects, okay? Second, you should only rely on criminal laws very, very exceptionally. Criminal law is a very blunt instrument that produces all sorts of bad side effects, and people generally should not go to prison for speaking, right? So you should only use criminal laws when that false speech causes very concrete, very specific harms, and you have to do so with rigorous culpability and causality requirements. What do I mean by that? It is much easier to justify criminally prosecuting somebody who intentionally lied and misled other people than a person who negligently or even recklessly spread false information, right? So the more guilty you are, the easier it is to justify this. And the more harm you do, the easier it is to justify criminal prosecution. It's one thing, as Maricela very correctly said, to put somebody in prison because they spread false information about specific cures for COVID, as opposed to criticizing the government's response to COVID. Okay? We should always be able to criticize the measures that the government has taken in response to the pandemic, for example. When it comes to media laws, the key issue is that the state must collaborate with other actors in the sphere, specifically with digital platforms. It must rely on research, on advances in science. It must learn from others. It must monitor whether the measures it has taken are actually working. It must engage in promotion of media literacy, of digital literacy, in campaigns of persuasion. And above all, the state must try not to be evil. If I can do copyright infringement of the Google slogan, right? Because remember, it is state misinformation that is normally way worse than private misinformation.
Thank you. Plenty to think about there. And thank you so much for sharing your expertise, Marko Milanovic and Maricela Simiu. Much appreciated. It'll be a fascinating area to watch how this evolves. Thank you for your time today, and thanks very much for watching.